In this podcast, we are going to be talking about change. And in fact, the next 3 podcasts are really a series. This first podcast will be about the stages of change and what that looks like. The next one will be barriers to change. What gets in the way when we want to do something, we want to change something in our role as parents. And then the third podcast will be about strategies, things that we can do to make the changes that we want to make last. Change is hard. In this episode, we're going to walk through the stages that people cycle through in their efforts to make change. This easily applies to parenting and also to understanding why our children may be resistant to change. Knowing this won't immediately fix things, but knowledge is power. When we know better, we do better. This episode will create the foundation for understanding how and why we change or struggle to change. In the 2 related episodes, we'll discuss barriers and then strategies, more tools for your toolbox for making change last in your parenting relationship with your child. Have you ever tried to change something and it didn't work? Have you ever tried to change something and it worked for a while, but then you went back to doing what you were doing? And have you ever tried to change something and it worked so well that you're still doing that thing that you changed today? Reflect for a moment on what change would mean for you as a parent. Pick a parent behavior that you want to work on. Maybe it's yelling less. Maybe it's spending more time with your children. Think about it this way. If you were to complete the sentence, what is one thing that I want to focus on to make change happen, to make things better with my child, with my relationship with my child? What would that be? When we talk about change, it's a relatively new concept. 2 psychologists, James Prochaska and Carlo Di Clemente, in the early 1980s, created this process while studying ways to help people stop smoking tobacco products. And the cool thing about the change process is while it was invented by people by psychologists trying to help people stop a behavior that was killing them, it has been widely used in many different fields of medicine and mental health for understanding the whole process of change and why some people are more ready than others to make changes and why sometimes change doesn't last. So we're going to talk about the stages of change if you're not familiar with them, and maybe you can better understand where you are at in this change process. I'll quickly label each of those stages. There are 6 of them. The first is called the pre-contemplation stage, then the contemplation stage, then the preparation stage, the action stage, the maintenance stage, and the relapse stage. So let's talk about pre-contemplation first. It's going to be fairly quick. So when it comes to pre-contemplation, that means that making changes isn't even on your radar. I'm pretty confident that if you're listening to this podcast, you're not at this stage because you're thinking about doing things differently. That's the next stage. Pre-contemplation is things are status quo. Maybe there's a lot of conflict. Maybe there's a lot of arguing. Maybe your kids are watching too much screen time and you're not quite sure how to get them off of their screens. You've tried, maybe haven't been successful. Things are just in a stagnant place and you'd like it to be different, as an example. So it's not even on your radar. The next stage, you're thinking about change. Maybe there's an awareness that something just isn't quite right with you as a parent. You might feel bad after you're done yelling, or when you take things away, then you give them back because you took them away for too long. And so if you're in that place where things just don't seem quite right, you might ask yourself, what would it take to do something different? And you start to weigh the pros and cons to changing. If I do this thing differently, how would my relationship with my kids be different? How would the time I spent with them be more enjoyable? If my child's behavior was different, how would it affect the rest of the family? If they transitioned more easily from what they were doing to getting in the car to go to school, How would that make our morning go smoother? And so we start to think about how change could maybe be beneficial for us. The third stage, preparing to make changes, really takes some planning and a lot of questions. And so you might start with asking yourself, what will it take to make changes in my family? What steps do I need to follow to start a change? How much time and effort would it require of me to change? One thing I have learned is that change is not easy. It's not like flipping a switch. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of repetition because you, as a parent, as a person, you're used to a routine, just like your children, just like your partner, if they're co-parenting with you. There are so many elements to this that it can feel overwhelming, but it is achievable. What do I need to do to become more effective as a parent if there's something that I need to change? And how do I know when I'm achieving my goal? What's it going to look like? In a previous episode, we talked about measuring behaviors. What's the frequency, the intensity, the duration of the problem? How do I make that smaller? And who's going to have to be part of this change process? If I do this on my own, will it be as successful as when I have my partner or my kids involved in this? And who's going to be part of the decision-making for making those changes? I'm pretty confident that if you've ever tried to reduce your children's screen time, they're not always all that excited about that. Sometimes spouses or co-parents aren't always excited about doing things differently. And so what do you do when you get resistance to change? That's part of the planning. What is it going to take to make changes? And one of the most important parts to remember is sometimes change occurs in small steps. The fourth stage is the action stage. That's where you actually implement what you're going to do. And it's time to implement those changes that you've been planning. And you might use checklists. You might have frequent conversations, at least once a day, with your spouse or your partner or with your kids about what's different or how it's working. You would anticipate, respond to challenges because, as you know, when you're working on change, sometimes it doesn't always go the way you planned. So you make adaptations to keep moving toward your goal. You monitor your progress every day. At the end of the day, you might look back on your day and say, how did I do with my goal? Not yelling, investing more time with my kids, being a better listener, being more consistent with my follow-through when I have a consequence. And so it's really important to keep track of it so that you can see there might be good days, there might be bad days, and there might be a pattern that you notice. It's important when you're at this action stage to celebrate your successes, to recognize that you can do this, it's achievable, and also to evaluate your failures, to notice, well, what happened there? Oh, okay, I was running late too, or, I really wasn't feeling well. I had this throbbing headache. That may contribute to not being as good at follow-through, or it was a weekend and we just had a lot less structured activities going on. It was a lot of free time and it got a little out of hand. So lots of things to look back at. This is not failure. This is learning. Maintaining change, once things become familiar and a routine, that's what change looks like. And I really want to encourage you as a parent to challenge your own light switch thinking. It's either on or off. Change is this gradual process. Real change can take weeks or months, even years, before you can look back and say, wow, look at how we've accomplished this. Back in the day, we used to do it differently. And that's something to get prepared for. It is not a singular event. It takes time. And then working daily towards your goals is really important when we're maintaining change. Stepping back at the end of the day, how did I do? What am I thankful for? Am I still moving in the right direction? Focus on progress, not perfection, because there are no perfect parents, no perfect children, and no perfect families. Talking about the change process wouldn't be complete without also talking about relapses. Relapses are setbacks. It's when we fall back to that previous pattern. things that we said we didn't want to do as much. We find ourselves yelling more. We find ourselves being more irritable. We find ourselves maybe spending more time on our own cell phones that we wanted to, even though it was a goal not to do that. That's really common. That does not spell failure. In fact, the shorter the relapse is, we call it a setback or a lapse, the shorter it is, the more likely you're going to get back on track. And so do that as soon as you recognize the problem. Determine what happened. Well, what caused that change in my behavior? I was doing so well. How did I fall off that cliff? What happened there? Well, it could be that you got too much going on. Maybe you had a sick parent. Maybe something happened at work that threw your whole routine out of whack. Maybe you just ran out of time, or it's possible you ran into too much resistance, or maybe there wasn't enough positive reinforcement for yourself or consequences for yourself, or maybe the rules weren't specific enough. And so it's important to step back and say, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. We're still on the right track. We know this can be done. When people are successful with making change, and it's a matter of figuring out how to maintain them. And when we do have setbacks, getting back on track, trying again until we master it. We've just talked about the process of change. Where do you think you are in your journey to make changes in the way you parent? What are the steps you've taken so far? And what are the steps for continuing on your parenting journey? In the next episode, we'll discuss some of the common barriers that parents face when trying to make changes. These are common, but they're not insurmountable. Remember, knowledge is power. Thank you for tuning in and considering this parenting topic. I hope that this information added to your growing toolbox for parenting your child or children. Please consider exploring other topics in this series. Remember, no one parenting tool can do everything. We need many tools to become the best parents for our children. Your children's future depends on you and the time and effort you invest in them today.